Tokyo firebombing. Tokyo wasn't the target, the people inside it were. On the night of March 9, 1945, more than 300 B-29 bombers flew toward Tokyo at low altitude. Instead of high-explosive bombs aimed at factories, they carried clusters of incendiaries designed to ignite wooden homes. The first waves dropped their loads across working-class districts where buildings stood only a few meters apart. Fires spread quickly through the narrow streets. Then the wind picked up. Entire blocks began to burn at once as temperatures inside the fire zones rose high enough to soften steel. People ran toward canals and rivers, hoping the water would save them. Many jumped in. The air started to move. Flames pulled in oxygen from every direction, creating a firestorm that fed itself. Survivors later described being knocked down by the force of the wind as burning debris fell around them. Asphalt softened under the heat. Some shelters became traps as smoke filled enclosed spaces within minutes. The raid lasted only a few hours. By morning, more than 16 square miles of the city had been destroyed, and an estimated 100,000 civilians were dead. The fire kept burning long after the planes were gone. Nanjing. The city had already fallen. The killing hadn't. In December 1937, Japanese troops entered Nanjing after weeks of fighting on its outskirts. Many Chinese soldiers had already retreated, leaving behind civilians and disarmed troops who had removed their uniforms to avoid capture. Patrols moved through the streets, pulling men from homes and shelters on suspicion of being former soldiers. They were marched toward the Yangtze River. Groups were forced to kneel along the banks and shot. Others were taken to open fields on the edge of the city. Foreign observers inside the international safety zone reported hearing gunfire day and night as detainees were brought out in waves. Some executions were carried out with machine guns, others with bayonets. Looting followed. Homes were broken into and set on fire. Civilians hiding in schools and churches were dragged outside. Women were taken from shelters and assaulted. Entire neighborhoods were cleared, street by street, as patrols moved deeper into the occupied districts. The violence lasted for weeks. By early 1938, tens of thousands of civilians had been killed, many of them unarmed. No one was left in charge of what came next. Bataan Death March. This was the surrender that began a march to death. In April 1942, more than 70,000 American and Filipino troops laid down their weapons on the Bataan Peninsula after months of fighting. Many were sick from malaria and dysentery. Some had been surviving on half rations for weeks. They expected to be transported to detention camps. Instead, they were ordered to walk. The march stretched for more than 60 miles under tropical heat that climbed above 38 degrees Celsius. Water was scarce. Anyone who stopped to drink from roadside puddles or collapsed from exhaustion risked being beaten or shot. Prisoners were packed tightly together, forced to keep moving as guards shouted orders along the road. Some fell within the first few kilometers. Survivors later described stepping over bodies left in ditches as the column moved forward. Trucks carrying Japanese troops passed by without stopping. At night, prisoners were given little space to rest and almost nothing to eat. The journey lasted several days. By the time the survivors reached Camp O'Donnell, thousands had already died from dehydration, disease, or execution. The march had begun after the fighting ended. Sandakan. Retreat meant they had to move. By early 1945, Allied forces were closing in on Japanese positions in Borneo. Inside the Sandakan prisoner of war camp, more than 2,000 Australian and British prisoners were already weakened by months of forced labor, disease, and limited food. Many had been surviving on little more than rice and watery soup each day. Then, the evacuation order came. Prisoners were told to prepare for relocation inland. They were marched out of the camp in groups, heading into dense jungle terrain toward Ranao, nearly 260 kilometers away. Most had no proper footwear. Some were too sick to stand. Guards pushed the column forward along muddy tracks, where progress slowed to a crawl. Anyone who fell behind was left where they dropped. Food ran out quickly. Medical supplies were scarce. The route climbed through steep hills and flooded paths as prisoners struggled to keep moving through heat and exhaustion. Survivors later described men collapsing along the trail, unable to continue. The march lasted weeks. By the time the final groups reached Ranao, only a fraction remained alive. 6 prisoners survived the war. Comfort women. For some women, the war came with a daily schedule. Across territories occupied by the Japanese military, women and girls were recruited from countries including Korea, China, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies. Some were deceived with promises of factory work or nursing jobs. Others were taken by force. Once transported to military-controlled areas, they were placed inside facilities known as comfort stations. These buildings were often set up near military bases and supply routes. Inside, movement was restricted. Guards stood at entrances. Women were expected to receive soldiers throughout the day, sometimes as many as 20 or more in a single shift. Military doctors carried out regular health inspections to limit the spread of disease among troops. The routine rarely changed. Some were held for months, others remained for years. Survivors later described having to follow strict schedules under threat of punishment if they refused or resisted. Many had been taken as teenagers from villages far from the front lines. The stations operated across different regions throughout the war. There was no leave, and no way to say no. Unit 731. Inside this facility, death was recorded as data. You see, near the city of Harbin in occupied China, prisoners were held inside a secret complex run by the Japanese military. Many had been taken from nearby villages or accused of aiding resistance groups. They were brought into sealed rooms where testing could begin. Some were infected with diseases such as plague, cholera, and typhoid. Doctors observed symptoms as they developed, measuring fever, breathing, and physical reactions over time. Others were taken outside during winter and had their limbs exposed to temperatures as low as -20 degrees Celsius. Water was poured over bare skin until frostbite formed. Then the tests continued. Frozen tissue was struck with wooden sticks to measure how it sounded. Some prisoners were later brought inside for surgical procedures carried out without anesthesia. Organs were removed while the subject remained conscious, so internal damage could be examined directly. The work moved beyond the laboratory. Infected prisoners were used to test how disease could spread under battlefield conditions. Biological agents were later released during field trials in nearby villages. The results were logged and studied. No one involved was meant to recover. Katon. Being taken prisoner no longer meant you would live. After the Soviet invasion of eastern Poland in 1939, thousands of Polish military officers, police personnel, and state officials were taken into custody and held in NK-5D detention camps such as Kozelsk, Starobelsk, and Ostashkov. Many believed they would be treated as prisoners of war until the conflict ended. Interrogations began instead. Prisoners were questioned about their education, rank, political views, and profession. Teachers, engineers, lawyers, reserve officers. Files were created for each detainee as officials reviewed their background and potential influence inside Polish society. Then their status changed. In early 1940, orders were issued from Moscow to transfer selected prisoners out of the camps. Small groups were loaded onto trucks and driven to remote forest sites. Their hands were bound behind their backs before they were taken inside execution areas one by one. Gunshots followed. Bodies were placed into prepared mass graves and covered with layers of soil. By the end of the operation, around 22,000 Polish officers and officials had been executed. Most never knew why they were being moved. They had already been marked for death. The Hunger Plan. The German invasion had already decided who would get to eat. In 1941, as Operation Barbarossa was being prepared, German economic planners began drafting policies on how to supply the army during a prolonged campaign in the Soviet Union. The plan focused on seizing agricultural regions such as Ukraine and redirecting grain shipments west toward Germany. Rail networks were reassigned. Food collected from occupied farmland was loaded onto trains and transported away from major Soviet cities. Urban centers deeper inside the territory were expected to survive on whatever reserves remained. As deliveries stopped arriving, ration levels in some cities dropped to just a few hundred calories per day. Winter made it worse. Fuel shortages followed food shortages as temperatures fell below freezing. Civilian populations began to exhaust their remaining supplies. Planning documents had already outlined the likely outcome if urban areas were cut off from rural production. Starvation would follow. Across occupied Soviet territories, millions of civilians died from hunger during the war. The outcome had been predicted before the invasion began. Siege of Leningrad. The city was meant to starve. In September 1941, German forces reached the outskirts of Leningrad and cut the final land routes into the city. Instead of launching a direct assault, they surrounded it. Railways were severed. Roads were blocked. Supply convoys stopped arriving. Food ran out first, and by November, bread rations were reduced to just 125 grams per day for civilians. That was all most people had to eat. Fuel shortages followed as temperatures dropped to -30 degrees Celsius. Homes went unheated. Public transport stopped moving. Electricity failed across entire districts. People began to burn furniture for warmth. Some searched for anything edible inside abandoned buildings. Others waited in long queues for rations that continued to shrink. By early 1942, thousands were dying every day from starvation and exposure. Bodies were left in stairwells because burial services had stopped operating. The siege did not lift. It lasted 872 days. More than 1 million civilians died without ever seeing the front line. Hunger had done the fighting. Operation Reinhard. This wasn't transport. It was a system built to kill. By 1942, deportation trains were arriving at camps in occupied Poland, including Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec. Entire families were packed into freight wagons with little ventilation for journeys that sometimes lasted days. Many arrived already weak from hunger and dehydration. The doors opened onto a platform. Guards ordered passengers to leave their luggage behind and form lines. Some were separated for labor. Most were directed toward fenced pathways that led deeper into the camp. They were told they were being taken for disinfection. Clothing was removed and groups were pushed into sealed chambers built to resemble bathhouses. Once the doors were shut, engines outside were started. Exhaust fumes filled the enclosed space within minutes. It was over quickly. Prisoners assigned to labor units were then forced to remove the bodies and transport them to burial pits or cremation sites. As deportations increased, the camps were expanded to handle larger transports more efficiently. Between March 1942 and November 1943, around 1.7 million Jews were murdered in these 3 camps alone. No one stepped off those trains to survive.